Today, let's embark on a journey through the seas of history to uncover the mysteries of the East India Companies. These weren't just trading ventures, they were true empires that commanded armies, fleets, and even minted their own money. How did they achieve this? And why is their influence still felt in the modern world? Get comfortable because the story, full of adventure and unexpected twists, awaits for you. And even deeper historical dives and stories that will lull you to sleep, be sure to subscribe to our channel. How the spices ruled the world, the rise and fall of the Dutch East India Company. Chapter 1. What are East India Companies? The name East India Company was actually born by many. In the age of discovery, European powers began to create special trading corporations, private companies that received exclusive rights from the state to conduct business with overseas countries. East India was a term used at the time to designate the vast expanse from the coast of India to Japan, including Indonesia, China, Thailand, Vietnam, islands and peninsulas that seemed almost mythical to the Western world. Every great maritime power wanted a piece of this eastern pie. Thus, the East India Companies emerged. The English established theirs in 1600. The Dutch 2 years later, then more. The Danish Company in 1616, the Portuguese 1628, the French 1664, the Austrian 1717, the Swedish 1731. They all strove for one goal: to control the richest overseas markets and the supply of the most valuable goods: spices, tea, porcelain, silk, and precious stones. But among all these companies, two particularly stood out, true titans, two colossi: the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. Each of them possessed not just merchant ships and warehouses, but their own armies, flotillas, fortified cities, and even the right to wage wars on behalf of their state. The greatness of these companies was measured not in the quantity of goods, but in the scale of their influence. These were giants whose power extended far beyond the borders of Europe. Our story today will be dedicated to the Dutch East India Company, also known by the acronym VOC, from its Dutch name, Verenigde Oost-Indische Company. We will tell how a small Protestant republic, breaking free from Spanish rule, built the largest transnational empire in the world in a matter of decades. How it established its forts, recruited samurai, fought with the Portuguese and English, monopolized cinnamon and pepper, exported tea and porcelain, traded stocks, and created financial instruments that we still use today. And in one of the following lectures, to maintain balance, we will also tell the story of the British East India Company, which was even more enduring and no less ambitious. Now relax even more and allow yourself to drift with the current of history. Imagine a warm wind, the sea breeze, the aroma of dried nutmeg and cinnamon lingering in the holds of merchant ships. The story is just beginning. Imagine Amsterdam in the 17th century, a city where you could buy shares in a company, sending ships to lands no one had yet written books about, where spices turned into gold and ships into naval fleets, where an ordinary merchant could get so rich from one successful shipment that his name would forever enter the annals. It was there that the story of the VOC was born, a corporation that became a state, and very soon We will journey with it across the oceans, throughout storms, to islands where cloves grow, and to bays where samurais stand. Let's delve into the past, where the scent of nutmeg fills the air. Chapter 2. Why was everyone hunting for spices? By the way, have you ever wondered why every kitchen, every simplest, has black pepper? Why are cinnamon, vanilla, ginger, cardamom, and nutmeg always to us in the supermarket for literally a couple of coins? It seems so mundane, so simple. A pinch of cinnamon in your morning porridge, a drop of vanilla in your baked goods, pepper in every other dish, and only history remembers what this luxury cost centuries ago. In the Middle Ages, spices were a luxury item on par with diamonds. For a pound of nutmeg, you could buy 3 sheep. For a small bag of pepper, you could exchange a sizable piece of land. And a gram of saffron could cost almost as much as a gram of gold. They were valued not only for their taste and aroma, but also for their almost mystical properties. Spices were considered medicines, aphrodisiacs, charms, sacred substances bringing health and good luck. They were like gold, but with a scent. At a time when food was poorly preserved, spices could mask the taste of spoiled meat, and in hospitals and monasteries, spices were used as remedies for mental and physical ailments. But where did they grow? Spices were obtained far in the east, on islands that Europeans called the Spice Islands. These are the modern Moluccas, Java, Sumatra, Banda, Ceylon. All of this is Southeast Asia, the very East Indies, where the ships of trading companies aspired to go. Obtaining spices was a long, complex, and literally deadly business. One expedition could last a year and end in death from a storm, disease, or pirate attack. Only 1 out of 3 ships would return, and even then, it was so profitable that people would mortgage their homes and pool family capital to finance a voyage to the East Indies. Because if a ship returned, it would return with gold only packed in bags of pepper. Imagine distant islands, hot sun, humid jungles, and in the forest cinnamon grows, with nutmeg trees nearby. Everything smells so bright and sweet that your head spins. This was a land where every tree has a treasure chest, and Europeans wanted all of it at any cost. But spices were just the beginning. The Dutch East India Company, like the English sister, was not limited to just the spice trade. Gradually, it became to explore everything that could be sold, from silk to tea to porcelain and opium. Yes, opium. That word still has a special connotation. Originally a medicine, later a means of control. The British made it the main export to China, but the Dutch also played a role. Opium like spices became a political, commercial, and strategic tool. Later, it would lead to the Opium Wars, the fall of Qing dynasty, and tragic pages in Asian history. But that's a completely different story. Today we talk about a time when the whole world seemed vast and full of mysteries, and spices were so valuable that cities were burned, marriages were concluded, people were killed, and entire empires were created for their sake. And against this background emerged the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, the world's first truly transnational corporation. A company with an army, a fleet, its own currency, flag, and diplomats. So powerful that it could declare war or sign a peace treaty on behalf of their state. So rich that by some estimates At the peak of its influence, it would be worth over $7 trillion today. Even the largest modern corporations such as Apple or Amazon pale in comparison. But more on that later. For now, just close your eyes and imagine a merchant ship. It's sailing on a warm sea with bags of pepper and clothes in its holds. Sailors full of hope in their cabins, and on the horizon, the East Indies, a land of wealth and death, of gold and spices. The story is just the beginning. Chapter 3: The Portuguese, Malacca, and the start of the race. In every great story, there is a gateway, a place where routes begin, winds converge, and interests collide. For the history of spices, that gateway was Malacca, a small city on the coast of the Strait of Malacca, located in modern-day Malaysia. Modest by European standards, but absolutely key to the fate of all Asian trade. To understand why it was so, imagine a map. The Strait of Malacca is a narrow sea passage between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra, Indonesia. All trading ships sailing between India and China passes through it. This means that anyone who wanted to control the spice route had to control Malacca. This city essentially became a cork in the bottle, both commercially and geographically. But let's start a little earlier. The spices we talked about grew far from here, on the so-called Spice Islands, Banda, Karnate, Tidore, Java, Ceylon. There nutmeg and cinnamon and cloves were harvested. Then the spices were brought to Malacca, the main port of the region. There, Arab and Indian merchants bought them, loaded them onto caravans, also transported them through a chain of trading posts deep into Asia and then to Europe. This was a long chain, and everyone who held at least one link in it earned untold riches. Just think, according to Chronicles estimates, spices changed hands 12 times on their way from Southeast Asia to the European table, and each subsequent seller sold for more. Therefore, even a gram of merchandise, especially valuable ones like saffron and nutmeg, became a true treasure. The city of Malacca became the natural center of attraction for all who wanted to participate in this business, and thus an arena for endless struggle. On the shore, ships of Arabs, Chinese, Javanese, and Indians constantly stood, all waiting for a favorable wind, because maritime trade of those times depended not on engines but on monsoons, seasonal winds that blew with astonishing regularity. While the monsoon blew in one direction, merchants set off. When the wind changed, they returned. Malacca became the place where traders waited out the season, replenished their supplies, repaired ships, and negotiated, quarreled, and intrigued. And at the beginning of the 16th century, new players entered this boiling trading point, the Portuguese. In 1511, a fleet equipped in Lisbon approached Malacca. They realized that capturing the source of spices itself was too dangerous and distant, but controlling their circulation was well within their power. Malacca was the logical choice. The Portuguese attacked and captured the city, establishing a fortress on the site of the old trading post. Thus began European control over the spice trade. This was a turning point. Previously, spices were traded by Muslims and Indians, and only crumbs from their table remained for Europeans. Now Europe directly entered Asian trade and quickly realized this is gold in packets. The Portuguese began to build factories along the entire coast, in India, Sri Lanka, Africa, and Moluccas. They gained control over the route, and it was there they who began to dictate terms. For almost 84 years, Portugal maintained a monopoly on spice supplies to Europe. It was during this time that it transformed into a maritime empire. Lisbon became rich, the elite prospered, cinnamon and in amples was sold in the streets, and nutmeg became a symbol of wealth. But as often happens, growth was fallen by stagnation. The Portuguese jealousy guarded their maps, hired only their own people, and kept the entire market secret. They refused to share navigation technologies and trained their navigators in secret. This became their weak point because at the very same time, the Dutch, left without access to ports due to the Spanish blockade, began to search for their own way up to the spices. And at the center of their attraction was still Malacca. The Dutch understood whoever owns this city owns everything. And to get there, they first had to understand the routes, get maps, assemble a fleet, and most importantly, learn to survive in this ocean of opportunities and deadly storms. It is from here, from Malacca, that the story of the VOC begins. Because one day, a ship with a Dutch flag will enter it, not just for spices, but for domination. Because unlike all previous traders, the VOC would become not an intermediary, but a new master. But until that moment, a little more time would pass. And now, imagine the morning in the port, the humid air, the aromas of pepper, curry, sweet smoke, cinnamon, the hum of hundreds in dozens of languages, ships at anchor, and in those holds, the fate of future empires is already hiding. Chapter 4: Holland in Search of the Path to Spices. The history of spices is a story not only of trade but also of power. To understand how and why the Dutch East India Company emerged, one must look at what was happening in Europe at the end of 16th century. Because without the Spanish lion, there would have been no Dutch dragon. At that time, Spain was the most powerful nation in Europe. Its fleet plied the Atlantic. Its galleons carried gold and silver from the New World, and the royal treasury jingled with coins. After the unification with Portugal in 1580, one monarch controlled everything one could wish for: Spanish colonies in America, Portuguese trading posts in Asia, control over Africa, trade with China and India, a monopoly on spices, sugar, gold, and slaves. It seemed as if the empire would last forever. But in its shadow, a rebellion was already brewing. The Netherlands, which were part of the Spanish crown, grew increasingly wary of this situation. The Spanish crown interfered in their internal affairs, imposed Catholicism in Protestant cities, levied taxes, and prohibited free trade. All this against the background of the cultural and religious independence of the Dutch gradually began to escalate into alienation. The alliance of Spain with Portugal hit the Netherlands particularly hard. From that moment on, the Portuguese colonies, the main source of spices, fell under Spanish control. This meant that all the ports where the Dutch could previously go for goods were closed. Moreover, the Spanish fleet began to sink. Dutch ships harassed captains and blocked sea routes. The Dutch were literally squeezed out of the spice market. This was not just an economic crisis, it was a war for survival. Dutch merchants found themselves cut off from the main source of wealth, the East Indies, and without the spice trade, the Dutch economy could not exist. In response to 80 years' war for independence began. The struggle of the Netherlands against Spanish rule. The Dutch didn't give up. They not only revolted, but also began to seek alternative routes. If they couldn't buy spices from the Portuguese, They had to reach them directly. If old maps were secret, they had to steal them. If they couldn't hire a navigator, they had to train their own. This was the beginning of an era when a small but persistent country decided to stand against a giant empire. And it was at this very moment that a special type of Dutch merchant was born. Not just a trader, but a scout, a navigator, an entrepreneur, and a pirate, all rolled in one. The first expeditions to the East Indies were desperate. People sailed into the unknown with stolen or forged maps, across stormy seas, without the certainty of returning. Many of them were killed, drowned, and betrayed. But those who returned brought with them ships filled with spices and with them hope. The Dutch began to act. They equipped ships, bought information, bribed, and in 1596 the first expedition reached the island of Java. There, amidst the greenery and humid air, they saw paradise. Cinnamon and cloves grew everywhere. All that for which wars were fought, here it was simply plucked from the trees. They founded a factory and the first Dutch trading post in East Indies. This was an event. Only one of 3 ships returned, but it recouped the entire voyage. The profit was astronomical. This sent a signal. We can trade directly without the Spanish, without the Portuguese, without intermediaries. But there was another signal as well. Those who brought profit gained unlimited respect and with it power. Dutch merchants became national heroes. Ballads were written in their honor, their portrait hung in the halls of town halls. They were not just making money, they were building an empire. At the same time, Holland, previously divided, officially declared its independence. The northern provinces united into the Republic of 7 United Netherlands, and the south remained under Spanish control. In the new republic, the most important force was not the army, not the royal court, but business. It was under these conditions, against the backdrop of a rapidly growing economy, the desire for independence, and the will to control trade, that the idea emerged that would change everything. Instead of many small companies competing for cargo, ships, and maps, create one great one that would unite everyone and become a new form of power. Thus, literally a couple of years later, the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, would appear. But its official birth was still 2 years away. And now, imagine an evening in Amsterdam, the canals, the lanterns, the windows of shops, behind which merchants in hats calculate profits, discussing how much a pound of clothes costs. And somewhere far away, on Java, at that very minute, the monsoon is approaching, ships are preparing to depart. On board is gold, not only ingots, but in bags of spices. Chapter 5. The first VOC factories on Java. The spice trade wasn't just profitable, it was a secret business. Every new sea chart, every freshwater point, every bay where cinnamon and clove trees grew was kept secret, as if it were a state military secret. And indeed, in 17th century, it was a military secret because spices equaled gold, and whoever knew the path to their source held the key to untold riches. When the Dutch found themselves cut off from Portuguese port, they had no sea charts, no navigators, and no navigational experience for voyagers to the East Indies. All of this was carefully concealed. The Portuguese guarded their maps with maniac obsession. Their loss could be punishable by death. They forbade hiring non-Catholic captains and sharing knowledge with foreigners. Yet knowledge is an elusive thing. the Dutch began an espionage campaign. Their people lived for years in Lisbon disguised as merchants, navigators, and translators. They bribed, extracted information, and stole. They sought the legendary path to the southern seas. According to one story, plausible through unproven, disgruntled Jesuits themselves, dissatisfied with their Portuguese patrons, sold a set of maps to the Dutch. If this is indeed a legend, it is a beautiful one. In any case, one man changed everything: Cornelis de Houtman. This man didn't just obtain information, he assembled an expedition. In 1595, his fleet of 4 ships set sail for the East Indies. This was the first true Dutch attempt to break through to the Spice Islands. The sailors suffered from diseases, died of thirst, and mutinied. 2 ships sank, 1 disappeared, but 1 returned, bringing with it so much nutmeg, pepper, and cloves that the cargo sold for an incredible profit. This marked the beginning of a new era. And although the Houtman himself was later eaten by natives during one of his expeditions, his name remained in the annals as the man who opened the way to Java. And so, from the late 1590s, Dutch ships began to regularly depart for the East Indies. They established the first factory in the Sultanate of Bantam on Java. Spices literally grew everywhere there. The humid air, warm climate, and fertile soil, everything was favorable. Merchants bought bags of spices and sent them back to Amsterdam. As before, usually only 1 of 3 ships returned, but even that one brought such profit that it covered the cost of the entire fleet. Thus, a new economy of risk and super profit emerged. It was like a lottery, but one where winning brought not only money but also status, influence, and sometimes power on a scale comparable to royalty. It was during these years that real competition at sea began. The Portuguese and Dutch sank each other, captured ships, and burned warehouses. This was a war, but without fronts. If today's competition is about discounts and advertising, then back then it was about cannons, sabers, and hanged captains. Yet the Dutch pressed forward. They managed to establish themselves not only in Indonesia, but also to look further towards Japan. In 1600, one of the first expeditions set off there, and on board was a navigator named William Adams, an Englishman hired by the Dutch for his maritime knowledge. He was the man who would turn the Japanese perception of Europe upside down and become the first European samurai. But more on him later, in a separate chapter. For now, all attention was focused on Java. Warehouses were built there, agreements were made with local sultans, and payments were made with goods and weapons. The Dutch understood the main thing. If you want to trade, first establish yourself, build a factory, bribe the ruler, protect yourself with cannons. And in these conditions, it became clear many competing Dutch companies among themselves were inefficient. They hindered each other, drove down prices, and lost ships. And then the idea emerged to unite all efforts, to create one large organization that would deal exclusively with trade in the East Indies, with state support, with a fleet, army, its own laws, and if necessary, its own currency. Thus, on the horizon, the VOC, Verenigde Oost-Indische Company, that is, the Dutch East India Company, began to take shape. But 2 more years remained until his official birth. And now, imagine an evening over Java, torches burning in the merchant's shop camps, bags of cinnamon neatly stacked in the hold, stars overhead, and navigators by the light of a lantern rechecking the maps, the very ones for which they spied killed and lost ships. They are looking for a path, and the path has already been found.